He's a father, he's a husband, he's a businessman, and for the past 12 years, Gary White has served on Charleston City Council. But now, he wants to be the next mayor of Charleston. I speak exclusively with Gary for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. And subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. Gary White, it's so good to see you for the first time on Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you for the invitation. Absolutely.
Anytime. Obviously, you are a current Charleston City Council member.
Right.
But now you are a mayor candidate for 2019.
Correct.
What got you from being a Charleston City Councilman to now saying, hey, I want to be mayor of Charleston?
Really what drove my decision was a number of my colleagues on City Council who I worked with for a number of years. They came to me and they recognized that we needed a change in leadership, and they asked if I would consider running. And it's very humbling to have your colleagues on council who are peers of yours and working with them for a number of years come to you and have enough confidence in your ability to consider you a good candidate to run. And so when the first individual came to me and asked me, was actually Keith Waring, and said, will you consider it? And I said, well, I'll think about it. And so a little bit of time went by, and Bill Moody then called on me and said, Gary, we were serious. We really want you to consider it. And a few others called. And so finally I said, well, let me go have a conversation with my wife and ask her opinion. And that's how it started.
And I want to go back to the Fitz News article from last month. It reads, well, you said this in quote, during that particular press conference, you said this quote, I've decided I can't just stand by and watch anymore.
Right.
How much have you been able to watch on this mayor's watch in your mind?
Right. So, I worked, having been on council for 12 years, I've had the opportunity to work under Mayor Riley or with Mayor Riley, right, and then now with Mayor Tecklenburg. And what I meant by that is that this is our city, and there's a significant lack of leadership currently in the administration. It's creating a significant void in the ability to get things accomplished and done in our city. But the other issue that is the lack of communication between the administration and council. And so those things are making council be extremely ineffective in doing its job, and we needed to have effective change to make that happen, to ensure that we can move the city forward.
Move the city forward. And I want to go back because obviously on your website you have a lot of things planned for Charleston. You said this: city drainage projects, maintenance of city-owned assets, development supported by community, control and protect city usages, more affordable housing, decreased traffic congestion. Let me go to the city drainage projects. You said this quote, I propose we look at funding drainage projects in three ways: reallocation of current city funding, identification of new funding sources, and cutting expenses and reallocation of those savings. Let me go to this first. The reallocation, that is, of this current city funding, what is that?
So the city the city does have a $200 million budget, and that's a significant number of resources. Now, a tremendous amount of those resources go to public safety. So fire and police always are number one, top of mind of what we need to make sure we fund. But there's still a tremendous amount of resources then after those funding of public safety that it comes down to prioritization. What is important to the citizens of Charleston? What's important to administration? So being able to look at some of the things that we're currently funding that may be that we need to consider other alternative sources other alternatives to use of those funding for the sake of drainage. And in particular, we have very small budgets when it comes to maintenance, not only of our facilities, but also stormwater and other things in the city of Charleston. And so that's what I mean by that, is taking a very hard look at saying, okay, we have resources available to us. Let's make sure that we're using them in the best way that we can possible for our citizens. And I think flooding is important enough that we need to make sure that that's a priority in funding, that we use the sources that we have available to us.
What are those alternatives?
The alternatives for funding purposes? Yes, well, I think that some of the things that we have out there that we give to a significant number of groups that I think that we could encourage them to find other sources. For example, we have a lot of nonprofits that we give to, and although that's very great and we want to be able to support our nonprofit communities, I think at the end of the day, for us to be able to distract some of our or move some of our funding from those sources to drainage, I think, is a potential opportunity for us to consider. And there's a lot of things like that that are out there. I'll give another one is the number of studies that we have. We do a tremendous amount of studies, millions of dollars worth of studies since the mayor has been elected. And quite candidly, we don't need any more studies. We need action. So my suggestion would be move past the studies and start taking those resources that are substantial in the millions of dollars and putting those towards projects such as flooding projects and maintenance that we need to take care of.
Since Mayor Teckelberta has been in office, and I know you just mentioned a number of studies that the city has conducted, how much has that cost the average taxpayer?
As far as the numbers of studies are
Yes,
concerned, you know, I don't know that I could put an exact figure on it, but if you consider there's 138,000 residents plus or minus in the city of Charleston, just consider, call it $3 million, $3 or $4 million worth of tax revenue that effectively spread that across that number of people, and that's what it's costing taxpayers. So those are real numbers that we can basically use to reallocate towards these other projects.
Development fatigue. You said this quote, under my administration, developers looking to build new projects in our city will be required to have the support of the community for their projects before I will give my support. What type of support are you looking from the developers?
So, you know, the development community, and I've worked with a lot of developers now on council because obviously we're required to. They do developments in our community. And every project that ever comes forward to me, I tell every developer that have you met, number one, with the community, and two, what is their opinion and support of your project? And that if they can't create a project that's an asset to that community, I won't support it. And I'll tell every developer, at the end of the day, if you can convince me and the community that what you're getting ready to build in this community is an asset, not a liability, then we can support the project. But if you don't, then you need to go back to the drawing board and make sure that what you do create is something that is an asset to our community. And we've done a number of things with specifically some of our neighborhoods downtown and doing community development agreements or community agreements with some of these developers where we've actually put deed restrictions on property that the developers have agreed to ensure that their projects do in fact turn into exactly what they've committed to the community for those projects to be. And so that's been very effective, and I'll continue to use that as a way to make sure that whatever gets developed in our city is an asset, not a liability to our communities.
How many deed restrictions are in place right now?
Well, the three that I can say specifically that I've been involved in were actually the Veggie Bin site that was done at Southern Land.
Right.
Another was the site at Market Street, which was the Samara Group. It's a hotel. And the other is the Grand Bohemian. So those are three that specifically in the district I represent have been completed.
Speaking of which, hotels and apartments. You said this quote, the issue with hotels and apartments that creates so much anxiety is not the fact that people don't like them, it is the number of hotels being built on the peninsula. The real problem is all about diversity of use. What is your definition of diversity of use? So
when you look across what makes up the charming character of our city, it's the fact that we have an office building that's located to a hotel that's located to a condo, and inside of that is a living neighborhood as well where you have single family residences. That is what is very different between the city of Charleston and anywhere USA. If you go to other cities across the country, what you'll find is a lot of those downtown areas, they go dark at night. At 5 o'clock, everybody leaves because they're just employment centers. But our city is a living city, and we have neighborhoods that are in the city, and people live there and they work there. And so when it comes to diversity of use, that's what I mean. We've got to encourage to make sure that our residents want to continue to live downtown, making us a living city. We've got to make sure that we have places that they can go to as far as work is concerned. So having office buildings downtown is obviously important. We have to have a place for tourists to stay. We've got a tremendous amount of tourists that do come to town. So we've got to be able to have a place for them as well. But these all things have to work together collectively, and through thoughtful civic planning, you have to be able to meld all these things together to ensure that they work cohesively together, they support one another, and that we don't let the pendulum swing too far and develop too much of one asset versus another. And that's really what it comes down to. I think that the fatigue that people are feeling now is the fact that we have such a tremendous number of multifamily developments occurring on the peninsula and really across the city, but particularly on the peninsula, and hotels. It's just really getting to the point where we just feel overwhelmed by just one type of use. And the city of Charleston has the opportunity to, under my administration, would have an opportunity through economic development to encourage developers to maybe consider and think about other things they can do on their properties versus just a multifamily site or versus a hotel, and then giving them incentives to be able to encourage them to do other things on those sites.
What would be those incentives?
So one of the things that I've contemplated, or not contemplated, but a plan that I'll put into action is creating an economic development department. And within that economic development department, we'll actually have liaisons that will work directly with the development community. So if a developer comes into the city and says, well, I want to do X on my property, and we'll say, well, that's fine. We would prefer, or one of our priorities is considering something maybe different. And if you do, in fact, consider doing something on your site that's a benefit that the city would see from a civic planning standpoint, we will help encourage your project through the process. We'll help shrink the time that it takes for you to develop your site as far as going through all the permitting and processing and giving them priority. And for a developer, time is money. And so if the city is able to actually shrink that time for a developer, but yet encouraging that developer to do something other than, let's say, a hotel, that's the way we can encourage them to do other things versus just being centric to one choice in how they develop their site.
And this is some developing news that was just sent to my email just recently. But the city of Charleston basically says this: Mayor John Tecklenburg will convene, that is, the inaugural meeting of the Charleston Hotel Task Force at 11 a.m. on Friday, right next door here at City Council. If you were mayor today, who would be the stakeholders that you would bring to the table as far as dealing with hotels?
Mm-hmm. So I started working about a month and a half ago on this, and I already started putting together what I thought were the right stakeholders to come to this together to make effective change with this hotel issue. So the groups that I believe need to be at the table are, number one, a representative from the community, from the neighborhoods downtown. I had suggested either a neighborhood president for Mansonboro or French Quarter because they most recently have experienced the most as far as dealing with hotels, and they have really, quite frankly, some of the heaviest concentration of hotels in the community. So a community member to represent that interest group. So obviously we want to have people from the Historic Charleston Foundation and with the Preservation Society, but we also need to make sure we have the Chamber of Commerce at the table. They're important. Obviously, they represent the business community.
Sure.
We need to also include hoteliers because, again, at the end of the day, this is going to impact them. They also deserve to be at the table, and then we need to make sure that we have the CVB at the table. The key to having effective change is making sure that when you want to change a law, you have to have everyone around the table rolling up their sleeves and having a discussion that's going to allow you all to then come to an agreement as to what can we all live with, what can we work with, and that's how you make effective change. But what the mayor has done time and time again, really as of last week for the fourth time, it's just putting together something but really not getting full input from anyone, whether it be council or other stakeholders. And so that process is stalled out. And really for the last 3 years. And so this will be the first time that we will actually, I think, see some meaningful change and some opportunities, but it's going to come down to the fact that we're going to have all the right players, hopefully, at the table. I've heard some discussions about some of the groups that whether or not some groups are not going to be present and invited to that committee. I'm hopeful that it will be holistic and inclusive, but we'll see. The meeting's tomorrow, as you said.
Housing, you said this, quote, the continued push for higher density market rate projects in the city is driving up land values and subsequently making it more difficult to build affordable housing.
Right.
How would affordable housing look under your administration?
So, as I mentioned around my concept of economic development and having liaisons in place to be able to help with developments and moving them forward, shrinking time for development, we can also do that on the affordable housing side because affordable housing in many cases are being done by private entities, although they might be nonprofits. They're separate from the city. And so time is money for them too as well. So we can use that same concept to shrink the amount of time it takes for developers from affordable housing purposes to be able to put up projects, shrinking the cost. We can continue to provide subsidies, which is obviously important so that we can make sure that properties can be attainable. Okay. But the other thing is that I think we need to rethink the way we consider zoning when it comes to affordable housing. We give a lot of developers opportunities to have an immense amount of density on sites, in some cases to be, quote, mixed use. But the reality is we don't have any stipulations in our zoning text that allow for affordable housing to have a higher, greater density of uses on their site. And really the density is the key component to being able to have housing and affordable housing in the city. So if we can take that same concept that we overlay on apartment complexes, but do the same thing for attainable or affordable housing, we can have the same positive impact.
And I know also you said this too, driving up land values. What are the land values right now in the city?
Astronomical. I'll give you a perfect example. When we allowed, the city of Charleston in 2005 had given the School of Law a piece of property.
Right.
It's been kind of top of mind for a lot of discussions.
Right.
At the time when we gave that to them, the intention was, of course, for the School of Law to put their school there. Fast forward to 2017, they decided that it wouldn't be feasible for them, and they wanted to sell it. There was a reverter clause that existed that said if they didn't use it for a school, it had to come back for the city. However, they wanted to sell it, and they wanted to take it and use that money to go buy another site. Well, at the time, what was brought forward to council and the information that was shared to us was that we were going to get lucky, if we would, to break even and get our loan paid back and give us about $1 million for releasing this reverter. So we thought, okay, well, let's press forward and let's at least help the school get to a new site. But then after 2 years later, we start to really find out more information. And most importantly, some of the things that didn't come up and should have come up, given the fact that the current administration, the mayor's son's firm, was involved in the transaction that should have been disclosed. The other thing that we found out was they were going to focus on making sure that this was going to be marketed for the highest and best use, which I would fully anticipate that. But we certainly had no idea that it would garner a price tag of $12.5 million. So in that, the city will get 3 and the School of Law gets 9. That's certainly, I see how you're, that quizzical look, yeah, that's what we said. So 2 years later, we started to receive a lot more information than we had when we first approved that. My point in saying, to answer your question, is prices in the city of Charleston have skyrocketed. And it's getting almost impossible to build affordable housing because of the cost of land and doing projects. And part of that is because we allow variances and we give more and more density. We've got to move away from that. And we've got to start focusing on making sure that people are doing projects in the city, but not creating such density on sites that they're driving up the values so that city can't even afford the land to be able to buy to put affordable housing on. The School of Law is just a good example of the price tags that properties are garnering now in the city of Charleston.
And you talk about the city of Charleston, obviously infrastructure. It is always talked at as about traffic congestion. You said this, quote, the current administration has supported initiatives to eliminate traffic congestion by encouraging people to get out of their cars and walk or bike. Although this is a nice concept, it's not always practical in Charleston. Can you talk to me about those initiatives right now?
Sure. So the concept of complete streets and public transit, those all are things we need to be focused on. But in reality, Charleston is not everywhere USA. And the way we're developed and designed and the way people actually, where they live and where they work, they don't allow for a lot of these concepts of, again, trying to get people to get out of their cars and get on a bicycle. And quite candidly, in the months of July and August, it's really not very practical for a lot of people to consider getting out of their car and biking 6 miles to work. So for the broader masses, so in concept, it's a great concept, but the broader masses, it's not appealing. So we have to have better alternatives, in my mind, that help people, encourage them to do, give them a better alternative to getting into their car. So whether it's carpooling or what we most recently saw with the initiative with the CRDA and the reboot, the commute, those are all the things that I think are important that can also help enhance and give us better solutions around traffic and transportation. But we can also focus on making sure that we're creating job centers across our city so that as an example, 83% of the people who live in West Ashley get in their car every day and drive somewhere else to work. If we created job centers within West Ashley where people could live and work, think of the number of trips, daily trips on 526 that we could take off because people wouldn't have to drive and get on the interstate and go somewhere else so they can work. And so I think that we can, and that really comes back to economic development, focusing on the right things and providing vision and leadership and civic planning around thoughtful planning so that we're looking at creating job centers in other parts of our city so that we give people alternatives.
And one last thing, you all said this too, and this is from the Fitz News article, you said this, quote, we need someone who has the financial wherewithal and the skill to set to manage this job. I've been in banking for nearly 2 decades. I come with a distinct skill set. This is about leading and managing a corporation with a $200 million budget and 1,700 employees.
Right.
So when if you become mayor, where would this money go as far as this $200 million budget?
So again, with the budget we have, a significant portion of that, probably 75%, goes towards public safety, fire and police.
Right.
That is obviously a critical component of what we do. The other components that we have to make sure, obviously, we're going to ensure that we're our environmental services and sanitation and all those things that we do as a city. And then we also have 1,800 acres of parks, and we have 4.4 million square feet of office space. So there's a lot of things that we need to be able to use those resources to, up to and including what we discussed when we started,
Right.
flooding and
Right.
addressing our drainage. And we need to make sure that we're allocating a lot of those $200 million in resources to maintaining our current infrastructure for drainage that we have. And we've got infrastructure in place. We just need to maintain it properly.
What is the city's credit rating right now under this current administration in your mind?
Right. So the current bond credit rating we have is AAA. We're one of the few across really. Actually, we may be the only one in South Carolina, and it is and it's a wonderful thing to have a AAA credit rating. And so some might ask, why is that important? It's important because that directly relates to how much we have to pay when we borrow money.
Sure.
And right now, we borrow money in some cases almost less than 2%. And the market that allows us to do that because we've got such a strong financial position. I will tell you, however, that currently under the current administration, we're at risk of losing our current bond rating. I would not be surprised if we end up under a credit watch at some point, because quite frankly, we have not had our eye on the ball and closely enough, and the budgets that we're putting together, we have a significant number of challenges ahead of us, and we need to have someone that has a lot of financial background and understanding to be able to make sure that we keep our bond rating, that we're doing the right things, that we're maintaining our assets, that we're using the $200 million we have annually in our budget appropriately, and all of those things to make sure that we maintain our credit rating and that we have great leadership and management in our city.
Let me reset. You are a family man. You're a husband, a father, a businessman, and of course you are a politician and running for mayor. When you take off all of those hats, who is Gary White?
You know, I'm a fairly humble guy. I just kind of I'm the kind of guy who likes to roll up his sleeves and get things done.
Okay.
I don't look for the limelight. I'm not real interested in being out. I mean, being in public office, you kind of get forced to be out in the public, but that's not my thing. I would never seek it out. I don't do it, and I'm not running for mayor for the title. I'm not running because it strokes my ego. I just want to do the right thing for our city. I want to make sure that we have good leadership and guidance and management. As you mentioned, I do have children, and two of my children are off in college right now, and one is in high school. And when they graduate college, I want them to be able to come back to Charleston.
Okay.
I want them to be able to come back and get a good job. I want them to be able to afford to live here, and I want them to then be able to afford to raise their family here like I did. And in order to do that, we have to have somebody who's mindful and focused on the leadership of our city and protecting our city and giving us great vision into the future and how we're going to make sure that we take care of the assets that we have and the charm and character of our city is preserved for our children and those to come. So who am I? I'm nobody special. I just want to roll up my sleeves and get to City Hall and start working for the citizens of Charleston.
And you talk about citizens. What about the African American community? How would you work with them if we become mayor?
You know, I've worked with my colleagues on council who represent the large majority of the African American community in Charleston, and I've had a great working relationship with them. Actually, one of them has endorsed me, and Councilmember Doug Gregory, and I'm very happy to have that. I'm very focused on making sure that all the citizens of Charleston are represented equally and fairly, and making sure that we're focused on providing for all of our communities, irregardless of geography, or race, or background, or anything else. And so I've worked very well with those communities and with my colleagues on council, and I absolutely intend to continue to do so.
How do you define gentrification in 2019?
Well, you know, it's I think it's best described, well, by definition, obviously, and that the tax base is causing a lot of folks to get pushed out. And as we were actually coming in, I think a lot of people feel that, and it's not really not about race anymore, to be honest with you. I mean, it is in essence, but people talk about their businesses getting forced out of because they can't afford. I had a conversation with a couple the other day who were getting forced out of downtown, and it was the same concept. They were being forced out because because they could no longer afford the taxes that they were facing. So I would say that although by definition gentrification really is associated by race, it really touches in Charleston a lot of more people than people realize.
Gary White, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Anytime.
All right. Great.
Yes, sir.